feeling groggy? I saw Dane like asleep on the couch earlier. 7:45, man, it's early. Look at him, still asleep, just sitting there, sleeping with his eyes open. Do you do that? Does anyone do that? Sleep with their eyes open? Sometimes, I think so. I think that's why I think we close our eyes when we sleep so we don't get stuff in our eyes. That's probably a good thing. But no, sometimes like I'm a super light sleeper, and sometimes like I'll be asleep on the couch and my wife will be awake and she'll be like, "Hey David, like what do you think about this?" She'll like ask me a question and I'll totally answer her, and then she'll be like, "What? That answer didn't make any sense because I was totally asleep." She'll be like, "Hey, what do you want for dinner tonight?" I'm like, "Oh, the sheeps. All the lambs are so cozy." And she's like, "What are you talking about?" But like my eyes are open too. I'm like, "The lambs are cozy. I don't know what's going on." And then she's like, "What are you talking about? You're creeping me out. I don't know what's going on." And then like she'll like ignore it and everything. And then like hours later, she'll be like, "What were you saying earlier? That was weird." And then I was like, "Oh, wait. I don't remember what you're talking about at all. I must have been asleep." So, a little fun fact about my life. Maybe you'll see who else sleep talks. Yeah, we got some sleep talkers. Ooh. Yeah, mumbling Jesus stuff. Yeah, Ford, you sleep talk? Dude, that happens to me and it trips me out. What Ford said was like sometimes his mom will come into his room and be like, "Hey, Ford, wake up." And then he won't wake up. He'll just have a dream that he woke up and like started his day and like, and then you like wake up in your bed, huh? And it's like the craziest thing. You're like, "Wait, I thought I woke up already. What's going on?" Well, anyways, that has nothing to do with the sermon at all. The sermon today, guys, we are going to start an identity series. Whoa, identity. We are going to take 4 weeks to dive into a series that explores our identity as Christians. And if you're not a Christian in this room, maybe you've like never started following Jesus ever, we're going to talk about our true identity, our best identity, who God created us to be, and how we can fully live into that and live to the best of our abilities and be the best version of ourselves that we could be. It's so important to talk about identity because the reality is everyone in this room, look around you, look at your neighbor. Everyone is looking for themselves. Everyone's trying to figure out who they are. And everyone is trying to place their identity in something. Even if you guys don't even like realize it, that's what's going on. That's what's going on in my life. It's not just like a middle school thing. Like this is like constantly a thing throughout all of our entire lives. It's like this weird human thing we do where we try to place our identity in something. We try to find ourselves in something. And we're really trying to figure out who we are, what we're doing here, where we belong, what we want to do when we grow up, who we want to be. We're all trying to figure this out. And as Christians, this is why we're talking about this in church, if we don't fully understand or lean into who God says we are, we will automatically search for our identity in something lesser than who God says we are. Everyone in this room, like I said, is trying to place their identity in something. And if you're not placing it, if your identity is not centered in who God says you are, you can find your identity in status symbols, like what team you play for, if you're playing like for this club team, like maybe like you find your identity in like if you're sponsored or not in like skating or surfing. Maybe you find your identity in the clothes you wear, like the kind of brands you wear. If you're like a hype beast, you find your identity in that. Maybe you're trying to find your identity in how beachy you are, how tan you are. Like there's so many things that are lesser than who God says you are that we're trying to place our identity in. And when we place our identity in these things, or when we look at all these things, like I said, like trying to be tan, trying to be the most tan, the most beachy looking kid, like that seems so much lesser when it's placed in light of who God says you are. All of these things begin to sound so small when we begin to talk about who we truly are in God's eyes and who God created you guys to be. Because you see, God knows exactly who you are. God created us and knows everything about us. In Psalm 139, you guys can read that on your own later. It gives an account of how God knows us and knitted us together in the womb. God knows what we're good at, what we like, what we don't like, how we think, and most importantly, God sees our potential and wants us to be the best that we can be. And when we live our lives as the person that God created us to be, we are being the absolute best version of ourselves. Who believes that today? Say, yeah. Well, if you don't believe it yet, let's talk about it. We can't fully understand who we are until we know whose we are. We cannot fully know our true identity until we understand who we are in God's eyes. In the journey of finding out who we are in this world, we must start by trying to figure out who God says we are. And when our identity is centered in God, we are free to be our true selves. We no longer need to pretend that we're something we're not. We no longer need to try to prove how cool we are, how funny we are, how pretty we are. We no longer need to show people how awesome our lives are on Instagram. We don't need to worry about that anymore. We're free to be our full, true selves when our identity is centered in who God says we are. So, we're going into a 4-week series where we will look at different things that God says we are in the Bible. Here's some fun titles that we have for the next 4 weeks that you can look forward to up here. So this series is called Who Are You? At Who Are You? It's like an Instagram handle. Today we're talking about child of God. You guys are all children of God. We're going to talk about it. Next week, we're going to talk about how we're all new creations. The week after that, we're going to talk about how we are holy and blameless. And we are God's workmanship will be the 4th week. So you guys ready? Say meow. 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 All right, let's dive in. Child of God. Today, we're going to talk about how Jesus, you guys know Jesus? Say meow. How Jesus made it so we are all now children of God. Everyone. Even if you haven't even realized it yet. Even if you don't know Jesus at all, Jesus made it so all of you, everyone in the entire world, everyone in this room, could be a child of God. Open up to Galatians 4:7. You got Bibles all around you. I don't know what page that is. Let's look at it. Galatians 4:7. Who knows the books in between, or the books that Galatians is in between? Galatians is in the New Testament. Ephesians is one of them. Yeah. And okay, 2 Corinthians. It's after 2 Corinthians, right, Isaac? So, after 2 Corinthians, and then Ephesians is the next one. Galatians 4. Starting at verse 7, it's actually on page 702. In Galatians 4 is a book written by the Apostle Paul. As you guys are flipping there, just listen to this background. It's written by the Apostle Paul to a church in the city of Galatia. Hence the name Galatians. In chapter 4, he begins to write to them. I'm assuming he's right-handed. I don't know. Maybe he's left-handed like me. He begins to write to these new Christians about who they are, about their identity. And not only is he writing to these people in Galatia, this is something that applies to just all humans who call themselves Christians. All humans throughout the entire world, even if they don't call themselves Christians. Paul is writing something that is so just universal that we can read today and apply to our lives as well. So let's dive in. Galatians 4:7 says this: "Now you are no longer a slave, but God's own child. And since you are his child, he has made you his heir." Now you are no longer slaves, but you are God's own child. And because you are his child, God made you his heir. Galatians 4:7. Paul is telling this group of people that you once had no identity at all. But now Jesus has brought you into God's family. Let me say that again. These people had no identity at all. They were lost in this world. They didn't know who they were. They probably knew, like, okay, we're Galatian people. That's it. I don't know. But they were Gentiles. They were not Jewish people. They didn't know where they were in this, like, new Christian life. They've accepted Jesus, but they weren't really sure about their identity. They didn't know where to place their identity. They had no identity. It says, you are no longer slaves. Slaves back then, that's just another way of saying someone who has no identity at all. So they went from having no identity and made a huge jump to being a child of God. They had no family, and then they made a huge jump into God's family. Think about that for a second. God's family. That's not just any family, you know? Like, it seems like a huge jump because it is a huge jump. God's family is a family where we are fully loved and accepted for who we were created to be and who we are. God's family is a family where we are set free from the things that we used to live for and find our identity in. We no longer need to place our identity in those lesser things. We are free to be who God created us to be. In this family, everyone loves each other. No one judges each other. There is no shame. No one casts shame on one another for being who they are. Everyone feels like they are enough. Everyone knows that they have worth. Sounds like a pretty cool family, huh? No judgment, no shame. You can fully be who you were created to be. You don't have to, like, try to fit in or anything. You can just be yourself. And everyone loves that. Well, let me tell you something. Because of the gift of grace that Jesus gave to us when he died on the cross, we all went from having no family, all of us, from having no family to being in the best family that we can possibly be in. God's family. Because of what Jesus did for us, because of Jesus' grace in wiping us clean, forgiving us for our sins, forgetting our past, bringing us into this new life, Jesus says, you had no identity before, but now your identity is a child of God. You are in my family now. But sometimes I'm like thinking about myself, how I interact with others, how I see people interact with others, especially Christians. And I think it doesn't really look like we are living in God's family all the time. it doesn't look like we can be in the best family that we can be in. It seems like there's a lot of people, there's a lot of judgment cast all the time. There's like mean words like thrown at each other over social media. People shame one another for like something as silly as like not even having an iPhone. It's like, oh, you have Android? That doesn't seem like God's family, does it? But let me tell you something. Paul was reminding the Galatians that they were children in the family of God. He was reminding them of that because they had forgotten. They were new Christians, started living their lives for Jesus, started trying to figure that out, but then they began to turn to their old ways. They began to do the things that they used to do that Jesus had set them free from. The things that were so damaging, they began to judge one another. They began to cast shame on one another. In Galatians 5:13 through 15, in verse 15 specifically, it says that they started biting and devouring one another. And I don't think it meant that literally. I don't think the Galatians were cannibals. Yeah, I really don't think they were. But Paul had to remind them, like Paul has to remind all of us every day, that we are children of God. We no longer need to bite and devour one another with the way we act. But like that seems like, wow, that seems like brutal, biting and devouring. I don't know about that. I don't do that. But when you think about like how you act at school, how you see other people act at school, how you see other Christians act at school, like there's definitely bullying going on. We know that for a fact. We see it all the time. There's definitely shaming going on. There's like stuff going on with friend groups where there's like, oh, let's exclude this person for like no reason, just to be mean. Let's just like push this person out. There's stuff going on in this new family of God that does not look like how the family of God should look. It looks a lot like how we were when we were placing our identity in other things, in status symbols, in trying to project a version of ourselves to the world that we are not. Sometimes we live based on our old identity when God has just completely thrown that away, made us free from it. We are no longer slaves, and we can be in this new identity as a child of God. And we often forget that we are children of God, and we don't want to. We forget that. Who forgets that? Who thinks that like, oh yeah, like I know I'm a child of God. I know I'm accepted, fully loved for who I am. But then sometimes I tend to forget that. I tend to forget my own worth. I tend to not even accept myself. I try to find acceptance in friends, and I forget that I'm fully accepted by God. I try to find acceptance from my coaches, and I forget that I'm totally, fully accepted by God. I forget that I have any worth. I forget that I try to just manipulate things, and I try to be the best version I could be, and I forget that God has created me so perfectly. And I can be the best that I could be when I'm living as a child of God and when I understand who I am in God. So today I want to close by reminding all of us that because of Jesus' great love for us, we are now children of God. And as children of God, we are called to clothe ourselves. This is from Colossians. But I'm gonna like flip it around and turn it into like how we talk a little bit. I kept some of the words because they're cool. Clothe ourselves with tender-hearted mercy, kindness, humility, gentleness, and patience. As children of God, as people in the family of God, we need to make allowance for one another's faults. We need to know that sometimes we're going to mess up, sometimes we're going to get on each other's nerves, and we need to be quick to forgive one another for that and accept us fully for who we are. We need to remember that the Lord forgave each and every one of us, so then we must go and forgive others. And in Colossians it says this, above all, clothe yourselves with love, which binds us all together in perfect harmony. Don't attack one another with your words. Don't body shame one another. Don't bring someone else down for having less than you, or bring someone else down for not being as good at you as Fortnite or some sort of sport. Don't bring one another down for just like stuff that doesn't even matter, for stuff that has no power over us anymore. But instead, let the peace that comes from Christ rule in your hearts. For as members of one body, as one family, as children of God in God's family, you are called to live in peace and always be thankful. So let one another, all of us, let's remember that we are God's children, and let's live our lives as God's children, living fully and completely in light of who God created us to be. So let's bow our heads. I'm going to call the band up one more time, and we're going to close out in worship. And as we bow our heads and prepare to close in a song, I just want to allow us to reflect on our lives. Reflect on the things that we have been placing our identity in that are lesser than who God has called us to be. Like I said, we're all placing our identity in something. So there is something that you are placing your identity in now. And maybe it's hard to figure that out. Maybe it's hard to know what that is. It could be a few things. But when you place your identity in these things that are lesser than who God created you to be, you're also acting and doing things in a way that is outside of who God created you fully to be. And this morning, I want you guys to just know that you are completely free from placing your identity in the things that don't even matter. You're completely free from placing your identity in anything that isn't who God created you to be. And even if you don't fully know the person that God created you to be, you can live in peace that you were created so perfectly in God's eyes, that God knitted you together in the womb, gave you gifts, talents, and abilities, made you look the way you look, made you think the way you think. And you can live in peace that even though we're all growing and we're figuring stuff out, we know that we are no longer slaves. We no longer have to live in fear. We no longer have to be afraid of people judging us. We no longer have to be afraid of people shaming us. But we can confidently step in to the life and the identity that God has for us. And we can show the world and tell the world, hey, I'm going to be me. You be you. You can judge me for being me, but I don't care what you think because I am a child of God. And that's the best that I could be. So when you're trying to knock me down with your words, when you're trying to judge me, you're trying to shame me, you're trying to make me embarrassed for who I am, that's not going to work on me anymore. because I know that I'm a child of God and nothing else matters. So let's bow our heads.